Hello. In this webinar, I'll be discussing the fundamentals of advanced literacy instruction. Designed for leaders and their teams working in linguistically diverse school districts, today's webinar focuses specifically on supporting the day-to-day instruction that English language learners and their peers receive. For those of you that might be new to this topic, all of the information discussed in our webinar can be found in our companion text. I'd like to kick off today's webinar by discussing 4 key shifts that are essential for improving the day-to-day instruction that English language learners receive. These shifts were identified over 5 years of close, embedded work with leaders and their teams in one of the largest urban school districts in the country. It was through this close work with leaders that we came to identify ways in which the existing instructional model would need to move or shift to accommodate the changing learning needs of students in our classrooms today. We boiled this down to what we refer to as 4 key shifts, which I'll be discussing in turn. The first shift pertains to how we use intervention to support the struggling population. One of our observations early on in our work with principals was that they were often operating through a system in which struggling students were supported through intervention alone. The day-to-day instruction wasn't tailored towards the population. Instead, their needs were met around the perimeter through a series of supplemental supports. For many schools that we worked with, this became a cumbersome and overwhelming system in which most of the student population was receiving intervention. And so we propose that a shift to this instructional model is instead to focus on strengthening the instructional core by customizing it to the needs of the majority of students in the learner population. And today I'll be discussing this shift in greater detail. The second shift pertains to how we use data to inform our instructional efforts. In many schools that we worked with, data was often sitting on the margin. Lots of data was collected, but rarely was it used to inform instruction. We suggest that a second fundamental shift is really to place data at the core, so that what we are teaching is very much linked to the sorts of skills that students need to acquire to be successful readers, writers, thinkers, and learners. The third key shift that we focus on pertains to how practitioners design and deliver instruction. One of our early observations from the field was that in the majority of schools that we worked with, practitioners were both designing the instruction and then they were delivering it. For many practitioners, this became an exhausting cycle. A third key shift that we suggest for leaders wishing to improve the teaching and learning of English language learners is to adopt a shared curriculum that can be used to support daily teaching and learning. This allows the practitioners in our building to really focus on the delivery of that instruction day to day. Finally, the fourth key shift is to move away from professional development models that focus on one size fits all, and instead to really think about how to move towards a 21st century model of adult learning that truly seeks to provide the sorts of knowledge that they need to engage in day-to-day teaching of the students that are sitting in front of them. If we think about the 4 key shifts, what are leaders focusing on? Well, they're really focusing on 4 aspects of the school literacy environment. They're thinking about the quality of day-to-day instruction that students receive. They're thinking about the degree to which learning is coherent and cohesive across an academic year and from year to year as a result of using a shared platform for teaching and learning. They're considering the manner in which assessment is used to identify the strengths and needs of individual learners and the population at large, and then how this data is used to inform instruction. And finally, leaders are thinking about the degree to which the adult learners in the building are provided with supportive and tailored professional learning, the sort of professional learning that drives high-quality day-to-day instruction. While we can view these as various aspects that leaders are focused on, they're very much interconnected, and each of these has a fundamental role to play in supporting high-quality literacy instruction for English language learners. And today, in this webinar, I really want to focus on Key Shift 1, which pertains to strengthening the instructional core, or the day-to-day instruction that all students receive. First, let's begin by thinking about the context of Key Shift 1. We found in many of the schools that we've worked with over the last 5 years that there is a series of outdated guiding assumptions and principles that inform an instructional model that relies heavily on intervention. Often, in many of the schools that we worked with, there was a belief that students who were learning academic English at school or as a second language were a very small subpopulation. However, the research suggests something quite different, and that is that the school-age population is incredibly linguistically diverse. In many classrooms today, English learners represent a majority. There was also this persistent belief in many of the schools that we worked with that prevented moving towards Key Shift 1. And that belief was that the strengths and the needs of English learners were in fact distinct from that of their majority language peers, and that they demanded different instructional approaches. While it is the case that English language learners, especially those who are at the very beginning of their English language learning journey, have particular literacy strengths and particular needs, it's also the case that by middle school, students who have been in attendance since kindergarten often have a very common profile to the English-only students that they sit shoulder to shoulder with in the classroom. This suggests that rather than thinking about English language learners as a specialized subgroup demanding unique instruction, we're better served by thinking of the common and shared overlap in the needs of English language learners and their peers, especially in communities that serve large numbers of children growing up in low-income homes and communities, where we find that the needs of children, regardless of their English language learner status, are quite similar. Finally, a third guiding assumption that many schools we've worked with have been operating under, and which prevents their movement towards Key Shift 1, is this notion that the instructional core is in fact preparing the majority of students to engage in advanced literacies, and that it's in fact a small population of those that are struggling and need supplemental intervention. The reality, in fact, is that in many schools today, the majority of students, more than 50%, are receiving a supplemental intervention, which raises fundamental questions about the strength of day-to-day instruction that students are receiving. And so this suggests that the instructional core needs to be updated and upgraded to match the needs of students in today's classroom. And so one way to think about this is when large numbers of students are struggling, the core is our primary line of defense and response. So how do we know if our instructional core is strong, if it is providing that high quality instruction that we know our English language learners and their peers so desperately need and deserve? Well, there are a few hallmarks that we believe can be used by leaders and their teams to identify high-quality day-to-day instruction. In classrooms where high-quality instruction is occurring, we would expect to see these 4 hallmarks. The first is that students are working with a variety of texts that feature big ideas and rich content. The second is that the environment is talk-rich, with lots of discussion and language building that is serving 2 functions, both to develop students' linguistic knowledge and to develop their knowledge of content and of the world. The third hallmark is that writing is used as a platform to build language and knowledge, and that students are engaging in both extended and sporadic writing throughout instruction each and every day. And finally, the fourth hallmark is that students are engaged in the study of a small set of very high utility vocabulary words needed to master language and content. When we think about the thread that would tie each of these hallmarks together, we think of the common use of protocols to support reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And so let's really concretize these 4 hallmarks. The first hallmark deals with the use of a variety of texts that feature big ideas and rich content. When we think about big ideas, we're talking about ideas that are multifaceted. So they're conceptually abstract, and they lend themselves to rich discussions around questions that have no single clear answer. They're engaging. They're relevant to the interest and experience of English language learners in the classroom, and they tap into students' desires to be part of and to understand the worlds beyond school, beyond the confines of the classroom. They're content-based, so they can be explored in science, social studies, and the arts. And English language learners should return to aspects of these ideas throughout schooling. An example of a big idea that we might tackle as part of a high-quality instructional unit is the idea of segregation and educational equity. This is a topic that's multi-layered and can be revisited. When we think about the alignment of our instructional design with Hallmark 1, we often think of the use of a variety of texts that feature these big ideas and this rich content. And we envision students actively working with and processing these texts. It often means that we're spending more than one day with a single text to really develop students' deep understanding of the concepts it presents. The benefits of this accrue over a series of lessons in which multiple texts on a single topic or concept are read, and so students are exposed to many perspectives and lenses that enrich their content understanding. The reason for this is because the topics that are featured in these texts are multifaceted. Let's now think a bit about the second hallmark, and that's the use of rich discussion to build language and knowledge. When we talk about discussion to build language and knowledge, we can imagine it happening in a cycle that looks like this. We read a high-quality text, we discuss it, we write about that high-quality text, we talk about what we've written, and we engage in additional reading on that topic. An iterative cycle like this allows students to both engage in talk, to process what they read, and to enrich their writing, as well as to support them as a pre-reading activity to consolidate learnings from prior readings. So when we think about aligning our instructional design with Hallmark 2, what would this look like in the classroom? We would expect to see that students are engaged in text-based talk with a clear and specific purpose. So whether it's to answer a text-based question or to take a perspective on an issue. We also would expect to see some sort of structure in place, whether it's a small group discussion or think, pair, share. These structures help students know how to engage in what is a cognitively challenging task. Students should be encouraged to adopt language from the text that they're working with to present their ideas and perspectives, as well as to adopt language from the teacher and from peers in the classroom. If we imagine the building of a high-quality language environment, we would expect to hear much of the language in text echoed in the conversations that students are having about a topic. So let's turn our attention now to Hallmark 3, which is the use of extended writing as a platform to build language and knowledge. So when we discuss Hallmark 3, which is the use of extended writing, we are again going to invoke this read, talk, write cycle, which we believe enriches students' knowledge of both topics and of language. Often when students are reading for the purpose of gaining content knowledge, this is enriched by their discussion of the topic, and then it's through writing where they apply both their knowledge of the topic and use the language that relates to explaining that topic that we see true mastery of both language and knowledge, which is why we believe writing serves such a fundamental role in the read, talk, write cycle. When we talk about aligning our instruction with Hallmark 3, we would expect to see students engaging in writing about text or on a topic or an issue with a very clear purpose. So they're writing to answer a text-based question or to take a perspective. And we expect to see that there's a structure in place to help them do this. It could be the use of a graphic organizer to structure their thinking before they write. Students are encouraged to adopt language from the text and to present their ideas and their perspectives using this language. Writing serves as a distal transfer task in which students take language from text and make it their own through the process of writing. And writing assignments should gradually require more extended writing. We can imagine across a unit that the writing demands build gradually from writing a short few sentence response about a perspective on segregation, for example, and this culminating in a larger project or essay in which students engage in extended writing. Let's now turn to Hallmark 4, which is the study of a small set of high-utility vocabulary words, those words that are most central for mastering language and content. We see instruction that is aligned with Hallmark 4. We would expect to see that students are studying maybe 5 to 7 words across a unit and across a series of texts. Often these words include a range of content area words, words like segregation that refer to large concepts, as well as words that are necessary for expressing academic knowledge writ large. So words like however, therefore, it is the case, that are used when reading and writing to string together ideas and topics, and so therefore fundamental for young readers and writers to master. And the reason we focus on a core set of words instead of, say, learning 5 to 10 unique words a day is because to truly master a word, we know that students need extended exposure. And again, students are encouraged to use this language when speaking and writing. When we talk about word knowledge, what does it really mean to know a word? At a very basic level, when we first encounter an unknown word, we have basically no knowledge of it. Perhaps on our second encounter, we have a general sense of the word. We've seen it and we kind of know what the word means. Subsequent exposures, we might have a narrow context-bound knowledge of that word. For example, the word segregation, we believe refers only to segregation that occurs in school settings because that's the only context we've seen that word in. Eventually, through subsequent exposures, we gain enough knowledge to understand a word, but perhaps not to recall it or to use it appropriately and independently in our own speaking and writing. And finally, when we truly have mastery of a word, we can use it in our own reading and writing. We know its relationship with other words, and we can use it metaphorically. When we're looking to assess if students have mastered the words that we've taught, we're really hoping to see it in their speech and their writing, which are the true distal transfer tasks. Finally, amongst the 4 hallmarks, we think of the use of school-wide protocols as a through line that knits together the 4 hallmarks of advanced literacy instruction. Well, the first reason that we suggest that schools adopt a set of discussion and learning protocols is that they facilitate student engagement in effective discussion, especially in peer-to-peer discussion, where structures and supports are necessary to really provide learners with a way to engage in what can be a very complex cognitive task. And so protocols essentially provide routines and manners of engagement that allow participants to focus on content. For example, in many schools we've worked with, they've adopted accountable talk as a paradigm for discussion. And what accountable talk essentially does is provide students with a set framework and a series of moves to engage in around discussion, as well as an understanding of how a discussion is conducted. When all students are aware of this, discussions flow more smoothly. And because students are not concerned with how to engage in the discussion itself, they can divert cognitive resources to focus instead on learning from the discussion and mastering the content that is being discussed. And so that is the reason that we focus so heavily on the use of protocols to support advanced literacy instruction. Now, there are a number of protocols available for free on the internet through the National School Reform Faculty website, but they also are built into curriculum and intervention. So expeditionary learning, codex, reciprocal teaching all contain protocols that support learning. If you're watching this by yourself, I encourage you to take a moment to think about this question. However, if you're sitting with a group of colleagues, this is the perfect time to pause this webinar and engage in a turn and talk. So I wanted to take a moment to discuss the interface between Key Shift 1 and 3. And so Key Shift 1 really focuses on instructional delivery, whereas Key Shift 3 is really about instructional design. So when we think about Key Shift 1, which is moving to focus on the instructional core instead of seeking to support our learners through intervention, we're really talking about enriching instructional delivery. However, when we think about Key Shift 3, which is adopting a shared platform or curriculum to drive teaching and learning, resulting in a more coherent and cohesive learning sequence, we're discussing instructional design. Curriculum has a number of benefits for teachers and for learners. So for our teachers, it frees time to think about instruction. So when we're not designing instruction, we can spend time thinking instead about how we'll deliver it. It allows for vertical and horizontal alignment. So it means that even without teacher collaboration, which is sometimes impossible, especially across grades, that from grade to grade, year to year, students are receiving similar instruction and instruction that builds upon itself. And that horizontally, within a single grade, all children are receiving the same content and knowledge-building instruction day to day. Good curriculum also serves an educative function, so it provides supports for teachers in implementing and delivering day-to-day instruction. So it might provide formats for conducting a lesson or suggestions for how teachers might structure student participation. And over time, this educates teachers in new ways to structure learning. Curriculum also has benefits for students. It creates familiarity with a core set of learning routines, and it presents information in a predictable format, which, as I discussed previously, reduces the amount of attention that students need to divert from content and language mastery. When we think about the adoption of a curriculum vis-a-vis Key Shift 3, what we're really thinking about is how to free teachers up to focus on Key Shift 1. And so we can't confuse curriculum materials with good teaching. But we can support good teaching with high-quality, comprehensive curricular materials. And so for instructional leaders, the task is really twofold. They have to select high-quality curricular materials and then establish buy-in amongst their staff around the use of these materials. And then they have to ensure that the curriculum they've adopted is implemented with fidelity and adapted appropriately and consistently. So this implies that we need a rollout plan and a process for making mid-course corrections to curriculum. So what makes a literacy curriculum high quality? Well, there are three things that leaders can look for. The first is that the hallmarks of advanced literacy are present in how lessons and units are structured to support learners and their teachers. In addition, curriculum should hold students to high expectations by including tasks and texts that are appropriately challenging given grade level expectations. And teachers are provided with all supports, so materials and instructional guidelines to execute any lesson as written. Now, of course, curriculum will have to be adapted to meet the needs of children who might be performing below grade level. But a primary concern that we have for our English language learners that surrounds curriculum is that often we find that they're very rarely exposed to grade level content and to grade level text. And so part of our focus in this webinar on exposing children to appropriately challenging grade level text is that it is within those texts that they are exposed to the ideas that are at the level that they can comprehend given their developmental age. And so despite the fact that a student might not be able to independently access the language of a complex text, we encourage teachers to expose them to those texts and to support them to read and comprehend them, because that is where the rich content information is that they need to master. So how do we begin leading Key Shift 1, which is the primary focus of today's webinar? Well, first, we need to build a team that makes up a broad coalition. So what do we mean when we say to build a team that makes up a broad coalition? Well, first, we mean that all of the key stakeholders are at the table, and that all of these individuals are viewed as hardworking and respected by others in the school community and can serve as change agents. If you elect to have someone else lead this process, we suggest that leaders still be present to show their support for the work. We also advise that specialists are involved from the very beginning of implementing Key Shift 1. So these should be English language learning specialists, reading specialists, and any of those members of our school community who have been delivering interventions. Often, as we implement Key Shift 1 and reorient to focus on the instructional core, the roles of those who have been delivering interventions changes. And we find it very helpful to involve these individuals in the redesign of instruction from the start so that they understand how their roles will be impacted by this shift in our instructional priorities. The second aspect of implementing Key Shift 1 at your site is to begin by organizing this group to analyze your current instruction. So before embarking on a redesign and refocus on the instructional core, we suggest that school leaders and their teams become very familiar with the instruction that's currently underway. The third aspect of moving towards Key Shift 1 involves setting a timeline for achieving these short-term, long-term goals and tasks. Finally, the fourth step of implementing Key Shift 1 is beginning to think about the messaging campaign beyond the small group who have been leading the curricular effort. Messaging is in fact one of the most critical aspects of an effort's success. Everyone at a school site needs to understand that any reform that we seek to implement is part of a thoughtful process which has been informed by student data trends, current research, and the needs of the educators and learners at the site. So how do we get started? Well, the first place that we suggest leaders begin is by reviewing pages 1 to 48 in our companion text, and then work on completing Leaders Tool 3.1, which is available in our text and at the Guilford site.